Welcome back, everybody, to another deep dive. This time, we're going to tackle something that's really fundamental to, well, being human.
Exactly. We're going to be diving into the philosophy of mind.
Specifically, we're going to be looking at some of the pioneering thinkers who really shaped how we understand the mind.
We're talking about Descartes, Locke, and Leibniz.
Three giants of philosophy.
And even though their ideas are centuries old, they're still incredibly relevant to how we think about the mind today.
Yeah, these are the guys who wrestled with questions like, what is the mind?
How does it relate to the body?
And where does our knowledge come from?
Big questions, right?
Absolutely. So let's start with René Descartes, the father of what we call mind-body dualism.
Now, what's interesting about Descartes is that he wasn't just a philosopher.
He was a brilliant mathematician, too.
And that really influenced how he approached understanding the mind.
He believed that to understand anything complex, you had to break it down into its simplest parts.
Kind of like reverse engineering.
Right. And he applied this same approach to the physical world.
He saw the universe as this intricate clockwork mechanism.
So for Descartes, everything in the physical world could ultimately be explained in terms of matter and motion.
He believed the most basic components of reality were extension.
Extension.
Yeah, the space a body takes up and motion.
Okay.
And he imagined the universe, he called it the world, as this amazing system of particles, all interacting with each other just like a finely tuned machine.
So the body, being part of the physical world, was obviously included in this grand mechanical system. But where did that leave the mind?
Well, that's where Descartes' famous declaration comes in. I think, therefore I am.
Ah, yes, probably one of the most famous quotes in philosophy.
For sure. But it's not just a catchy phrase, it's the foundation of his belief in the mind.
The mind separate from the body.
Exactly. For Descartes, thinking was proof that the mind, or the soul, existed. And since the mind could think, but it didn't have a physical form like the body, it had to be a separate entity.
It's an interesting idea, this mind-body split. But it raises the question, how can something that's not physical control something that is physical?
Yeah, if the mind isn't made of matter, how can it interact with the body?
Yeah, it's like trying to steer a car with just your thoughts.
Exactly. That's the whole puzzle of what we call interactive dualism.
Interactive dualism.
Yeah, it's the idea that the mind and body, although distinct, somehow influence each other.
But how?
Even Descartes struggled with this question.
He tried to address it, though, right?
Well, he proposed that the pineal gland, which is a tiny structure in the brain, was the meeting point of the mind and body.
So like a central command center.
Sort of. He thought that the mind could influence the flow of what he called animal spirits in the body.
Animal spirits.
Well, we know them now as cerebrospinal fluid.
Oh, okay.
But his explanation wasn't entirely convincing, and even today, the question of how an immaterial mind can interact with a physical body remains a big challenge.
So while Descartes might not have nailed down all the answers, he definitely got people thinking about the mind-body connection.
And that's had a lasting impact on fields like psychology and neuroscience.
Yeah, think about it. Even today, we're still trying to understand how our thoughts and feelings affect our physical health.
And how our physical health affects our mental states.
So while his ideas about the pineal gland might not hold up scientifically today, his emphasis on the mind-body interaction was really groundbreaking.
Absolutely. Plus, his emphasis on reason and skepticism played a huge role in shaping the scientific method.
You know, questioning what you believe and looking for evidence. Okay, so that's Descartes, the mind-body dualist. Let's move on to John Locke, an English philosopher who had a very different view of the mind.
Now, Locke was really immersed in the world of experimental science.
And that definitely influenced his thinking.
He proposed this revolutionary idea that the mind at birth is a tabula rasa, which is Latin for blank slate.
So instead of coming pre-programmed with innate ideas like Descartes believed, Locke thought that all our knowledge comes from experience.
Yeah, it's like a newborn's brain is like a fresh canvas.
Waiting for the world to paint on it.
Exactly. What do you think about that idea?
A blank slate, huh? That's a pretty radical departure from Descartes.
It really was. And Locke's ideas had a huge impact on how we understand learning, memory, and even personality development. It challenged the prevailing view that we're born with all our knowledge prepackaged.
It's like Locke handed us this blank slate and said, okay, world, go ahead and write on it. It really makes you think about how much of who we are is actually determined by our experiences.
That's the core of what we call the nature versus nurture debate. It's still a hot topic in psychology even today.
Nature versus nurture, genes versus environment. That's a debate that's been going on for ages.
And Locke's ideas really fueled what became known as British associationism.
Associationism.
Yeah, this idea that our minds are constantly forming connections between ideas.
Okay, I can see how that fits with the blank slate idea. Our experience is right on the slate, creating these connections in our minds. But how does that actually work?
Well, associationists believed that our minds naturally link ideas based on a couple of key principles. One is contiguity.
Contiguity.
Yeah, it basically means experiencing things together in time or space.
Okay, so like always having popcorn at the movie.
Exactly. That repeated pairing over time creates a mental link between movies and popcorn.
So the next time I go to the movies, I automatically crave popcorn, even if I wasn't consciously thinking about it.
Right. It's become an automatic association.
Interesting.
And the other principle is similarity.
Similarity.
That's about associating things that resemble each other.
Like seeing a red apple and thinking of a fire truck.
Exactly. Our brains pick up on those similarities and make connections.
It's amazing how our minds are constantly creating these webs of connections between ideas. No wonder our thoughts can jump around in such seemingly random ways sometimes.
Associationism tried to explain that complexity, the sometimes chaotic nature of human thought, and it really laid the groundwork for some of the later psychological theories that we know today.
I can definitely see how this idea of associations paved the way for understanding things like classical and operant conditioning.
Oh, absolutely.
Pavlov's dogs, drooling at the sound of a bell, Skinner's pigeons pecking levers for rewards. It all comes back to forming associations between stimuli and responses.
Right. That's the core of it. And the impact of associationism goes even further. It's influenced how we understand things like memory, language, and even emotions. It's not just about simple connections. It's about how those connections shape our whole mental landscape.
So it's really a holistic view of the mind, recognizing how interconnected our thoughts, feelings, and experiences are. Who are some of the key figures in this associationist movement?
Well, there were several influential thinkers who built upon Locke's ideas. One was George Berkeley, an Irish bishop. He actually applied associationism to the study of vision.
Vision, how does that work?
Well, Berkeley argued that our perception of depth, how far away something is, isn't something we're born with. He said it's something we learn through associating visual cues with our sense of touch.
So when we reach for something, our brain learns to connect the visual information about its distance with the feeling of our hand reaching that point in space.
Precisely. It's like our senses work together to teach us about the world.
That's amazing. Our brains are constantly learning and making these connections without us even realizing it.
Right. Berkeley's work on vision was pretty revolutionary for its time. And then there's David Hume, a Scottish philosopher.
I've heard of him. He was a bit of a skeptic, wasn't he?
Oh, he was a major skeptic, famous for it. He really challenged a lot of assumptions about knowledge and causality.
Causality?
Yeah, the idea that one event causes another. Like if I push this glass, it will fall.
Right.
Well, Hume argued that we can never be absolutely certain about cause and effect. He suggested it's more of a mental habit. We see events happening in sequence, and our minds make a connection. But we can't actually prove that one event caused the other.
Wow, that's pretty mind-blowing. It really makes you question everything you think you know.
Hume's skepticism was definitely a game changer. It forced people to really examine their assumptions about the world.
So Berkeley tackled vision, Hume tackled causality. Who else was in this associationist crew?
Well, there was David Hartley. He was an English physician who tried to link these psychological processes with what was going on in the brain, the actual physical stuff.
Oh, so he was trying to bridge the mind-body gap, even back then.
He was way ahead of his time. He proposed this idea that vibrations in the nerves, tiny vibrations, were responsible for ideas.
Vibrations in the nerves.
Yeah, and when those vibrations happened repeatedly together, the connections between those nerves would become stronger.
Creating an association.
Exactly. That's what he believed formed the basis for memory.
So he was basically drawing a connection between mental activity and the physical structure of the brain.
That's right. It was a very early attempt to understand the biological basis of mental processes.
Incredible. It's like he was foreshadowing the field of neuroscience.
He really was. Hartley's work was a real pioneering effort to understand what was happening in the brain when we think, learn, and remember.
It's fascinating how those early associationists were starting to unravel the mysteries of the brain. But didn't their theories evolve over time?
Oh, definitely. James Mill and his son, John Stuart Mill, they really fleshed out these ideas in the 19th century.
The Mills, father and son, both philosophers, right?
And they were particularly interested in how experience contributes to individual differences.
So how our unique experiences make us who we are?
Precisely. James Mill was pretty hardcore. He believed that everything in our minds, every thought, feeling, idea, could ultimately be broken down into those basic sensations and associations between them.
So kind of like a super reductionist approach.
Yes, exactly. But his son, John Stuart Mill, he took a more nuanced view. He still believed in the power of experience, but he recognized that some mental phenomena were a lot more complex than just simple sensations strung together.
So it sounds like they were wrestling with some pretty profound questions about what it means to be human, how our experiences shape us, and the limits of our understanding.
Absolutely. And their work really laid the foundation for some of the key debates in psychology that we still grapple with today.
That's amazing. So we've got Locke emphasizing the importance of experience, which led to associationism and ultimately influenced behaviorism. But what about Leibniz? He had a different take on the mind, right?
Leibniz, yes, he was a fascinating thinker, and his ideas had a big impact, particularly on continental philosophy.
Continental philosophy.
Yeah, so thinkers in mainland Europe, especially in Germany, he influenced guys like Kant, Hegel, and Schopenhauer.
Okay, so while Locke's ideas took root in Britain, Leibniz's ideas spread through mainland Europe.
Right. They were intrigued by his concept of monads and the idea that our minds come pre-equipped with certain capacities.
So were these two schools of thought, British associationism and continental philosophy, completely separate?
Well, there were definitely points of connection and influence. Think about Immanuel Kant. He was deeply inspired by Leibniz's idea of innate mental structures, but he also recognized its limitations.
So he took bits from both sides.
Kind of, yeah. Kant agreed that our minds come with certain built-in categories of understanding, ways of organizing the world. But he argued that these categories don't dictate the specific content of our experience.
So it's not like we're born knowing that a chair is a chair or that the sky is blue.
Exactly. But these categories provide a framework, a way for us to make sense of the sensory information that we get from the world.
Okay, that makes sense. It's like our minds have these built-in lenses that shape how we see things, but the world itself isn't predetermined. We still have the capacity to learn and adapt based on our experiences.
Exactly. Kant's Copernican revolution in philosophy really shifted the focus from the world itself to how our minds make sense of the world. And that had a huge impact on how we think about perception, cognition, and even the nature of reality itself.
It's amazing to think about how those philosophical debates from centuries ago are still relevant today. They're still shaping how we think about the mind. But let's circle back to Descartes for a moment. We talked about his mind-body dualism, but what about his overall impact on Western thought?
Descartes' influence goes way beyond his specific ideas. He was a champion for a new way of thinking. He emphasized reason, skepticism, and the pursuit of clear and distinct ideas.
So it's not just about the content of his ideas, but his method, how he approached knowledge and inquiry.
Exactly. He was a major figure in the development of what we call the scientific method. He really advocated for a systematic and rigorous approach to knowledge.
Questioning what you believe, looking for evidence, testing your hypotheses, that's what we do in science, right?
Yeah. Exactly. Descartes' emphasis on doubt and critical thinking laid the groundwork for the scientific revolution, and it's still absolutely essential for any kind of intellectual pursuit.
His legacy is a testament to the power of ideas, how they can shape our understanding of the world. And speaking of powerful ideas, this whole discussion about associationism, it seems really connected to the rise of behaviorism in psychology, doesn't it?
Absolutely. That's a great observation. We'll definitely explore that connection in the next part of our deep dive.
It's amazing how all these pieces fit together. It's like we're uncovering a hidden history of the mind.
It really is a fascinating journey.
And I can't wait to continue it. Stay tuned, everyone. All right, we're back, ready to finish our deep dive into the philosophy of mind.
Let's do it. It's amazing how those philosophical ideas we talked about, they really laid the foundation for what we know as modern psychology today.
I know. It's like they were planting seeds for a whole new way of understanding the human mind.
Their impact is undeniable. Those philosophical seeds blossomed into all these different fields of psychological research, from how we think and behave to the way we experience the world.
So how did those abstract philosophical ideas translate into actual psychological research? It seems like kind of a big leap from, pondering the nature of the mind to actually doing experiments in a lab.
Well, one really clear path leads from British associationism, with its emphasis on experience shaping the mind, right to the rise of behaviorism in the early 20th century.
Behavior is, oh yeah, the whole stimuli and responses thing.
Exactly. Behaviorists like John B. Watson and B.F. Skinner, they revolutionized psychology. They said we got to focus on what we can actually observe behavior.
Yeah, so instead of trying to figure out what's going on inside the mind, they focused on how people act, how they respond to different situations.
They were all about studying behavior and the environmental factors that influence it.
It's kind of like they shifted the focus of psychology from introspection, looking inward, to outward observation.
Exactly. And that helped make psychology much more scientific. Behaviorists championed empirical research, designing experiments, collecting data, testing hypotheses. It was a whole new way of approaching the study of the mind.
So even though they weren't directly studying mental processes, they were still revealing a lot about how learning shapes our actions.
Absolutely.
I mean, there are experiments like Pavlov's dogs drooling at the sound of a bell or Skinner's pigeons pecking levers for rewards. They showed just how powerful those learned associations can be.
Those experiments were groundbreaking for sure, and they've had a huge impact on things like developing therapies for phobias and anxieties and creating effective teaching strategies.
It's funny how behaviorism, which seems so different from those early philosophical debates, is actually deeply connected to those associationist ideas. It's all about the power of experience to shape who we are.
That's a great point. And as psychology continued to evolve, those philosophical threads just kept weaving their way through different schools of thought.
Like with the cognitive revolution.
Exactly. The cognitive revolution was a major turning point for psychology.
I remember learning about that in my psych classes. It's when the focus shifted back to mental processes, right?
Right. So in the mid-20th century, psychologists started questioning whether we could really understand human behavior without understanding how people think, remember, and process information.
Yeah, it's like they decided to crack open that black box and figure out what was actually going on inside.
Exactly. They wanted to know how the mind actually works.
So what prompted that shift? What made them decide to go back to studying mental processes?
Well, a few things happened. The rise of computer science and information theory had a huge impact. People started thinking about the mind as an information processor, kind of like a computer.
Oh, that makes sense. The computer analogy really took off in the 20th century.
It did. And that led to all sorts of new ways of studying the mind. Cognitive psychologists started using computational models, thinking about the mind in terms of algorithms and information flow.
Wow. So they were applying the principles of computer science to the human mind.
Right. And that led to a real explosion in research on things like memory, attention, decision-making, all the stuff that goes on inside our heads.
It's amazing to think about how that computer analogy really changed the game for psychology. It opened up so many new avenues for exploration.
It did. And while cognitive psychologists don't usually go around citing Descartes or Locke in their research papers, their work is still informed by those early philosophical discussions about the mind and how we acquire knowledge.
It's like they're still having that same age-old conversation, but now they're using all these scientific tools to test those ideas.
Precisely. So we've seen how those philosophical roots run deep in both behaviorism and cognitive psychology. But are there other areas of psychology where those connections are evident?
Well, what about developmental psychology? They're all about how we grow and change over time.
That's a great example. Developmental psychologists are really interested in how early experiences shape our cognitive, social, and emotional development.
Which brings us back to the whole nature versus nurture debate.
Exactly. It's that age-old question. Are we primarily products of our genes or our environment? Or, more realistically, some complex combination of the two?
It seems like that debate is never going away.
You're right. It's still a hot topic. And while most developmental psychologists today recognize that it's not a simple either-or answer, that tension between nature and nurture continues to inform research on all sorts of crucial things.
Like how babies learn language.
Yeah, or how we form attachments to our caregivers, even how we develop a sense of morality.
Wow, so those philosophical questions about the mind, they're woven into the very fabric of who we are.
They really are.
And it sounds like psychology, in all its various forms, is trying to untangle those threads to understand how all these different factors come together to make us who we are.
That's a great way to put it. And the influence of those early philosophical ideas doesn't stop there. We see those threads running through social psychology, clinical psychology, even neuroscience. All these fields are grappling with fundamental questions about the mind that philosophers have been wrestling with for centuries.
It's just amazing to think how those big questions about the mind have echoed through history, shaping how we understand ourselves and each other. It really shows you the power of philosophy.
It does. Philosophy gives us that framework, that space to ask those deep questions that drive our quest to understand what it means to be human.
Well, I think we've reached the end of our deep dive. We've journeyed through the history of philosophy of mind. From Descartes to Locke to Leibniz, we've traced their impact on the development of modern psychology.
We've seen how those philosophical conversations from centuries ago are still relevant today, still shaping how we think about the mind.
It's been an amazing journey, and I hope our listeners have enjoyed exploring this fascinating world of ideas with us.
I hope so too. And as we resurface from this deep dive, I encourage everyone to reflect on what they've learned. What new insights have you gained about the mind, about knowledge, about consciousness?
How has this exploration shifted your perspective?
Keep those philosophical gears turning. The journey of understanding the mind is never really over.
So until next time, keep exploring, keep asking those big questions, and never stop wondering about the incredible world inside your own head.